Land Connections Illinois FarmLink program, and I'm joined by Kathy Ruhf and Mike Ghia of Land for Good. This webinar series grew out of the extensive work that we and the Land Connection have been doing together to develop a how to buy a farm guide. And that's going to be covering in a very comprehensive way everything from finding land to buying land to working with professional service providers and many other things. The guide, by the way, will be released in early 2026. It's currently being graphically designed. Our hope is that the guide, in combination with these webinars, will enable farmers like you to have success, less stress, and successful land tenure that will be really critical for you to have security, hope, and the ability to plan long-term for your enterprise. We also wrote this guide, by the way, for the many service providers out there who are helping farmers find land. We hope this guide is helpful for you and the farmers that you help. Last week's session focused on the search and how to complete the process, the purchase process. Today's second session is all about making you aware of the wider spectrum of farm purchasing options. And it's actually interesting because this guide and our work in this webinar series came out of the question of alternative and other options. We were running into a lot of people who were trying to do for sale by owner and other options, and we did not know ourselves how to do that. And we talked to Land for Good, and Land for Good said, well, if you're going to explain those, you need to explain the very basic structure first so they understand the basics. Final session next Thursday will be all about the professional service providers you might be interacting with. We're going to have a real estate agent, a banker, and a attorney as well, talking about different aspects of the process. Today's session, just to kind of give you a brief overview, we're going to begin with a presentation by Mike Ghia about the for sale by owner or private transaction purchase process. There'll be a short Q&A after that. We're then fortunate to have farmer Harold Wilken, who has done a private sale and is going to share some of his, how that worked for him. We'll hear again from Mike about the seller financing option before Kathy Ruhf covers many of the other purchase options that you may or may not be aware of. And then at the end, we're going to take some questions before letting Jesse and Rachael Smedberg of Tulip Tree Gardens share their unique farm purchase and refinancing experiences. A few notes about today's webinar. First, this is intended to give you a wide mental map while doing so in a very brief period of time. So forgive us if we can't go into a lot of detail about every session. The guide will have more information, and you can also find many great resources at the Land for Good website at www.landforgood.org. Please do mute your video and your audio so we have as much bandwidth as possible and few distractions. For asking any questions, please use the chat function. In the interest of time, if there's a lot of questions coming in about something, we will moderate and pick out the questions we think have the widest of interest. We'll officially end the webinar at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, but we will continue a Q&A session after that for another 10 minutes for people who might be interested. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available as a YouTube eventually. All registrants will receive links to the recordings by email after the series is over. We also urge everyone attending to be respectful and compassionate in your interaction with our speakers and other attendees. Without further ado, let's dive in. And now I want to introduce our next speaker, Mike Ghia, Land for Good's Vermont field agent. He grew up on a farm and has been involved with agriculture since childhood. He has dedicated much of his life to helping many, many farmers with their land access challenges. Mike, why don't you take it away?
Morning, afternoon, depending on where you are. So as Nathan said, the first segment here, I'm going to talk for the next 10 minutes or so about for sale by owner or direct private sales. So by that, what we're referring to is basically any sale that does not involve a seller real estate agent listing a property. Those we'll discuss. There may be some limited involvement of real estate agents, but basically it's not publicly listed through a real estate agent, but it might be listed publicly otherwise. We're also not going to be talking in this segment about auction sales. And a lot of people might think about for sale by owner and think about something where it's posted for sale by a sign or website or some of the other techniques we've talked about and we'll talk about. And it might be strangers buying from strangers or strangers buying from strangers interacting together. It may be it might be a publicly advertised, or it may not be. It may be people approaching each other. Farmers very frequently will go beat the pavement and go ask around and look for people who might be interested in selling their property, who haven't even posted it anywhere. And then there's the other people who have gotten to that point already and are publicly posting it. But I listed here a bunch of other for sale by owner situations that we're commonly dealing with. Family sales, of course, within families. Neighbor to neighbor is very common, particularly if maybe they're leasing from that neighbor already. And a lot of farm properties in the United States never ever get on the public market in any way, whether it's publicly listed by the owner or by a real estate agent. And so, it's really important to be, as we talked a little bit about last week, about thinking about this in a more broad perspective. Landlord tenants to landlord or tenants purchasing from their landlords is a common scenario. And so you get your situation in a situation where you have a lease. Maybe you don't even know that it's originally it's going to be an opportunity to purchase, but that may come down the pike. We worked in a number of scenarios where employees are buying from their employer. We at Land for Good, we work on a lot of farm transfers, and a lot of the farmers we work with don't have identified successors, and particularly when they might have a turnkey business that's viable, we look at opportunities for them to transfer the business either to an employee or to recruit people in as successors. They may become business partners at the beginning and start building equity in the non-real estate part of the business and then buy the real estate later. And then there's sometimes opportunities where farmers might buy from institutions that are advertising directly, and particularly land trusts. Some land trusts are doing buy, protect, sell projects where they might acquire a property first, then protect it by the conservation easement, and then they'll make it available for sale, often in a public request for requests for offers, but sometimes there might be people that they've already been working with for a period of time who are farmers that they've gotten to know, who they have confidence will be able to farm the property, and they'll work with them, and the property will never get publicly posted, but the land trust will step in as an intermediate buyer until that successor buyer is able to come in. So it's not just for sale by owner, can be a variety of different things. Real quickly, we covered this last week to some extent, and to a large extent, Nathan covered about places where for sale by owner might be over advertised, but I want to just put these out here again, including some of the real estate aggregator websites like Zillow will allow for sale by owner properties to be listed, and then there's also sites that are specific to that. When you've got a specific geographic area that you're looking at, there are sometimes community forums where people will post it. Social media is a way that a lot of people will get out there with properties that they're putting up for sale. Farmer organizations, I don't think this one got covered last week, but if example would be here in the Northeast Organic Farming Association, they have the chapter in Vermont has a website with classifieds, and people will post their farms for sale by owner there. And then some groups have farmer discussion groups. So we have very active Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers Association here, where people are posting all kinds of things, including equipment for sale, but sometimes they'll post their property available for sale. So if you're farming out there, make sure you join these different agricultural organizations, because it may give you some connections. So the paper bulletin boards, the signs on the classic signs on the road, The FarmLink websites that we mentioned before, the two that our two organizations are behind, the Illinois FarmLink and New England Farm Finder. So there's a variety of different ways that when there are publicly advertised that you can look to find them, find the property. So where may a real estate agent still play a role? The seller might not have it publicly listed, but as they get further into the transaction, they may contract with a fee-only real estate agent to help with different aspects of the real estate transaction. They may just do that with their attorney, but sometimes they may bring in a real estate agent. And then, of course, you may want to work with a buyer's agent on things like figuring out what to offer or gathering information on the property, particularly if the seller is not putting out there as much information as necessary. It may help you with the negotiations and the paperwork. But the one thing to keep in mind is that sellers who are deciding to go for sale by owner may not want to deal with the real estate agent at all and just say, I don't want to deal with this. And they may, in extreme cases, they may say, I don't want to deal with you if you're going to bring a real estate agent into this picture. And so you need to be, just aware that may come up. And often the real estate agent will say, well, if you have a buyer's agent, how am I going to get paid? Because typically it's through a commission. Now that's changing. We won't go into the details on that, but in the last year, the whole commission structure started to change in the United States. But they may, often in the past, they would approach the seller and try to sign a contract so that they could get a commission in the sale. And many sellers will just say, for sale by owner, I didn't go with a real estate agent for a reason, and I don't want to deal with this. So it may be on you. You may have to, there may be a commission structure that you pay, or you may want to do a fee only contract. Of course, you don't necessarily need a real estate agent. Real estate agent in this case. You definitely need other advisors, though, and particularly Oh, I missed this slide disappeared. And sorry about that. And so you may have other advisors that you are working with. In particular, you want to be working with a real estate attorney. And as we talked about last week, there was a bunch of other farmer advisors that may be helpful to you. And those advisors, they can play a role in advising you. They can't represent you, but they may be able to help you through figuring out many of the pieces of the puzzle. Negotiations and communications, and the difference in the for sale by owner is you're not communicating through agents. Now, sometimes that can be helpful because you're talking directly to each other and not through other people. So it eliminates the game of telephone that we talked about last week, where real estate agents maybe don't know anything about farms, and so they're not actually helpful in conveying information back and forth. So that actually can be a benefit sometimes in having a for sale by owner contract or situation. But sometimes it can be challenging, and even if, or especially if family and friends, if you're buying for family and friends. And sometimes when communication is difficult, going through a third party can take out the emotion and can be helpful. So you might bring in an agent, or you might use your attorney, or you might use agricultural mediation. In some cases, they might be available to help you at least figure out the communications aspects and how to break the tension if tension is built up in these transactions. Sometimes it can be just a matter of saying, well, let's just give this to each of our attorneys, and they'll help with particularly some of the contract aspects. And because they're professionals, they don't have the emotion involved. Sometimes that can quell some of the difficulties that can come up in some of these transactions when you're dealing directly with each other. And overall, just you need to keep it business and not make it personal, not take things personally, understand the other side. And this, of course, goes even if there's a real estate agent involved, as I mentioned last week. You want to make sure that you're just keeping in mind that everybody has their own interests that they need to look out for. Most people, want the deal to be fair to everybody, but they're going to be looking out for their own needs, and you need to do the same. And it's nothing personal. One of the things that we see come up with for sale by owner that can be challenging is getting the proper information from the owner. It's up to the seller to provide all of the property information and disclosure that normally a real estate agent would help them pull together. And some sellers are much better at this than others. And I have, over the several years that I've been doing this kind of work, I have seen so many times where there are sellers doing for sale by owner who really shouldn't be doing it on their own because they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what information is needed. And you start asking questions of things that they should be able to tell you and they can't tell you. But don't be afraid to ask for the customary and reasonable information and documentation that you need. You may get some pushback even sometimes. It might be just not even that they don't know, but they're like, why do you need to know that? Sometimes it can help to say that your attorney or lender is requesting that info because it's like, well, you're just some dumb kid. I don't, why do you need that stuff? I was like, well, this is what my attorney or my lender is asking me. Unfortunately, sometimes you'll see that these people have to have like 5 or 6 buyers come along that are all asking the same questions before they realize, oh, this is something that I need to be providing. And then even if you have a relationship with the seller or you're already farming the property, it's important to get all that necessary documentation and do your due diligence in the same way. So for instance, if you're leasing, you may think you already know a lot about the property and you certainly know about the land and the barns. You may know about problems in the house if you're renting a house. But there's going to be things like you've probably never looked at the deed. If there's a survey, you've probably never looked at it. You may not know where the property boundaries are. If there's a conservation easement, you may not know anything about it and what the terms are and what restrictions might be on you going forward. And so it's important to just think about everything that's necessary in a customary real estate transaction and start to gather that. So in many cases, you can download a property disclosure form that the real estate agents would typically use. So we talked about last week, that's mainly going to focus on the house, but that is still going to be information that you're going to need about the septic system, the condition of the roof, the heating system. And you can sometimes if they don't already have it, we've given the seller, here's the form that the real estate agents would use. Could you please fill out that form? The disclosure forms are part of their own liability anyway. If they're hiding things, it can become a problem later on and could end up in court. So it's better for them if they just put all that information out to you to begin with, to any potential buyer. I guess this slide somehow got moved. This was the group I was mentioning earlier of the potential advisors you could be working with. Not being licensed real estate agents, advisors may be limited in their roles of advising. Except for your attorney, most advisors are just providing advice and cannot represent you in the transaction. But we can provide a lot of other different types of information that'll be helpful to move things along. When viewing the property in a for sale by owner situation, the advantage can be that you're viewing the property with the owner. A lot of times when there's real estate agents have listed the property, they'll often shoo the seller away when they're showing the property. And then you get into that game of telephone, as I was just mentioning, about trying to get questions answered. So there's actually can be an advantage is that you have that direct contact with the property owner so that you can ask questions directly. And you also may have a better opportunity to convey your interest in farming and your background in farming. And as we talked about last week, sometimes that's what's important to the seller. It's not just about the price, not just about the money. And if they see you as a real viable candidate to steward their farm into the future, having that direct contact, which you don't always get, which you sometimes can get, but you don't always get when it was for sale through a realtor, can be a benefit to helping you get your foot further into the door. But again, you need to remember this is still a business transaction. And when you're viewing the property and talking with the property owner throughout the process, you need to balance the honesty and openness that we all want so that we're all working fairly on a fair transaction, with being careful about disclosing any information that might compromise your negotiating position down the pike. So when it comes to negotiating, when it comes to figuring out what the value of the property is and negotiating the price, when the seller puts the property value out there, some sellers will have done some thorough research to come up with the price. and some not so much, and some not at all. And particularly if you've approached somebody that wasn't even thinking about putting on market, they may not have a price in mind, and that can certainly slow the process down and make it difficult to think about what is a realistic price for this property. If they don't have a reasonable sense of market value, what I've observed is they often are asking above market, and that can make price negotiations difficult. Sometimes, if they haven't done enough other research, sometimes it can be useful to pay for an opinion of value from a real estate agent or to get an appraisal to get to a reasonable number. But these take time and money. I generally prefer the information from an appraisal over an opinion of value, because a lot of times the real estate agents, when they're doing that, are not being as thorough and looking at the differences between the comparable sales. And so they may not be looking at the nuances of what makes each property different enough to give you a strong enough price. But appraisals are much more expensive and take a much longer period of time. And it depends on where that seller is at. Are they publicly advertising it, and they're not necessarily going to want to wait to go through an appraisal process. But if it's one of these for sale by owners where maybe the time is not of the essence, you might have some time for that. But if you do get an appraiser, it's important to use one that will be acceptable to your lenders, because not all lenders will accept appraisals from all appraisers, and it just makes it easier later. You may only have to pay for appraisal update and not a full appraisal in the lending process. Sometimes not having a real estate agent commission involved, because there's no realtors involved, can help with the negotiating. So for instance, when my wife and I bought our home, our landlord, we were renting, our landlord was getting it appraised for a divorce, and I said, well, we're interested in buying, and so here you can let us know what the appraised price came up with. And so I knew she was gonna have to pay a 6% commission. I offered her 5% less than the appraisal, because I said, you're still going to be ahead. And that's how we did the transaction. Uh-oh.
Another couple of minutes, Mike?
Yeah, except I'm having a problem moving. It's not moving. Let's try it again.
How many more slides do you have?
I think I had 2 left.
Okay.
Except it doesn't want to move. All right, well, then in the interest of time. Uh-oh.
Okay, I'll suggest, Mike, that you will pass the baton back to Nathan for the interview with Harold, and and you don't have any questions for this segment. So I'll give people some time to put any questions in, and then when you do your next part, if you can bring up those remaining slides and make your points, then that would work fine.
Yep, sorry about that.
All right, back to you, Nathan.
All right, thank you. So right now we're gonna have a brief conversation with Harold Wilken, an organic grain farmer in East Central Illinois. I'm going to ask Harold some questions about his experience with a purchase of 80 acres through a private sale. Harold, first of all, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy delivery schedule. Great to see you again. Can you please tell us a little bit about your farming, where you farm, what you farm, and how much land do you own versus lease?
Thank you, Nathan. Well, we're located an hour and a half south of the Circle Interchange in Chicago, right along Route 57. Our farm consists of about 4,000 acres, where a little over 500 is owned. The rest is rented from people who want their farms to be farmed organically. I said earlier, but we have been farming organically 21 years. My son now has taken over the day-to-day management of the farm, along with my nephew, and I'm still very much involved in the operation and making the major decisions, but I've passed the baton.
Great. So you told me about this private sale opportunity that came up. Can you tell me about how it came up? Who were the landowners? How did that first conversation happen?
Yes. So I had a neighboring farmer that decided that he was going to retire, and 200 acres of what he was farming was owned by cousins, and they had decided to sell. And so he reached out to me, wondered if I was interested in buying any of the 200 acres. And then we started the conversation from there.
Got it. And why did the landowners want to do a private sale?
They were as much concerned about what was going to happen with the farm as they were getting it sold. The tenant that I actually ended up renting his farm to, his family, he was fourth generation, and only his family had farmed that farm. So from the time it was deeded to them from the railroad in 1860s, it was farmed by the same family. So us being organic, they were interested in what we were doing as far as our practices, and they wanted it to go to someone who would take care of it.
Got it. So how did you go from that initial conversation or interest to actually working on a transaction?
Well, first of all, we're on Zoom today, right? So these particular three descendants of the original owner got on Zoom, and we talked about some land sales that had been in the area, and we made an offer based upon the sales that had happened in the last year. And at the same time, I kicked in an appraiser to do an appraisal on the farm just to make sure that we were in the ballpark.
Got it. And so did the appraisal come first, or was there a purchase sale agreement that was drawn up first?
They actually happened about the same time, and the appraisal came back right at the number that we were looking at, because we felt that we were offering a fair price. It's the best land in the area, and so I wasn't going to, number one, chintz them. I wanted them to feel comfortable with what we were purchasing it for. And anyway, so we ended up doing an agreement on the appraised price. They all came together about the same time. And then they offered me a 3% discount since we didn't have to go through a realtor. So we had one lawyer that drew it up. I did have my lawyer just read over the details, and everything was fine. And so that was we all met, signed all the papers in the same place, and we're Facebook friends. So, but we offered a price that I felt was fair. And I wanted this relationship. I knew they were worried about what was going to happen with the farm. And I think with us and the organic, it's so much about relationships. It really is. The land is not a commodity to those people.
So in that first conversation that you had, did you immediately jump into transaction, or was it at first just kind of getting to know each other and getting to know each other's values?
Well, we spent probably 50 to 75% of the conversation on who we were, what we were doing, those kind of things. And then it got down to, well, this is what we're offering. This is why we're offering it. And this is where we feel comfortable. And they said, okay, they would, talk amongst themselves. They got back to us within 24 hours, and we had a Zoom shake agreement.
So, and then how did the closing go? Say more about that, because that was in person, right?
Yeah, You know, we agreed to the lawyer that they had recommended, somebody that they had used. Like I said, I had my lawyer look it over, but then we all met in person at the lawyer's office, and then went over to the title company. We did all the transaction, and that was the end of it.
Got it. And were there any contingencies at all in the agreement, or was it just,
No, I knew the land. I mean, I've been farming in that area my whole life. I knew the quality of the land. The tenant had given me the tile maps, yield data, all those kind of things that, you know, would normally be, well, what, you know, what's it going to yield, blah, blah, blah. And I actually farm 80 acres that borders this. So I already knew the potential of the land.
got it? And how did you, by the way,
Lost you.
Whoops. So while we're waiting for Nathan to get back, oh, there you
Oh,
are.
here's Nathan.
I'm back. I'm sorry. I'm in a different location. Last thing, how did you finance your transaction, Harold?
Um, so doing a 1031 with my nephew. We sold him our farmstead with 40 acres, another tract that, you know, we owned. And so there was very little money that needed to be, we didn't have to take out a mortgage. We did a short-term loan that at the end of this year, it will be paid off.
Got it. So one last question. You've been living in that area a long time. You've seen a lot of private transactions. Any other advice, like just one or two pieces of advice about finding those opportunities?
I would rather do all day long the type of transaction we did. One where it's a family, you get to know each other a little bit, but really, the tenant was their cousin. He recommended us. It was pretty well cut and dried as long as we agreed on price and terms. And we did, and it was a very smooth transaction.
Great. All right. Kathy, do you want to take any questions or transition us to Mike again?
Yeah, we've got a couple of minutes. We have one question about how do you find the participant said an assessor. Maybe that means an appraiser.
Yeah, an appraiser.
And
Yeah.
how much do they cost? So two-part question. How did you find one? And how much did they cost, if you can share anything about that?
It was $900 for the appraisal, for the 80 acres. And we used an independent appraiser. We've had him before. They're available all over. You can do an appraisal by a real estate agent. My feeling there again is they've got kind of a bias. And so I like the idea of the independent appraiser. And again, with Google search, they're pretty easy to find.
So there aren't any other questions. I'm thinking, Mike, I'm wondering whether you might comment for a minute or two about what would be different or more important on a property that has infrastructure, particularly like a house or older barn buildings where there probably needs to be a little bit more due diligence. Harold had the advantage of knowing that acreage quite well. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I'll last week we talked a lot about evaluation, so I won't go too much in there, but I did want to comment on the appraisal part of it. So the appraisal, once you start getting other buildings and infrastructure in, is going to be more expensive. What we're generally seeing here for a property with a house and barns and any significant acreage is at least $2,500 or $3,000 for the appraisal. And it could, if it's a larger property, it could be more than that. So it didn't surprise me when he said 900 for just for
Just
just
the land.
open
Right.
land, but with other
Right.
infrastructure, it's definitely going to be more.
So there's a comment here which is important. A bank cannot use a broker's opinion. You need a licensed real estate appraiser that is on the bank's list.
Right. That's what I was mentioning earlier, that even if you have a licensed real estate agent, you need to make sure that, as I said, they're on the list. And particularly if you're going to go to FSA, they often have a very short list.
Of qualified appraisers.
Right. Appraisers that the lender will work with. So that comment is, right on target there. And as I said earlier too, and then Harold was also, I think that the opinions of values are just not as, from the real estate agents, are just not as thorough. And particularly if you've got a farm, if you've got a farm with housing and infrastructure, and those all can vary and be different in terms of how much grain storage they have, how size the barn, all that sort of thing, that you have to start making adjustments. And certainly the difference in soil quality as well. All of those things you really are the nuances that a thorough appraisal will go through, that often the opinion of value falls short on. And so it's not as good at comparing different properties of those recent sales to say, well, I'm going to adjust up or down the property that we're considering here in terms of trying to pin down a price. And so when it's possible, the appraisal is the better way to go all around, but they are more costly and take longer.
Thanks. Before we move on, is there one last question for Harold? Otherwise, we'll let him go and move on to our next presentation. All right. Thank you, Harold.
Harold, thank you so much.
Thank you, Harold.
Well, thank you. You guys have a great day.
Have a safe
All right. Thank you so much.
All right, let's see if we can get this back on track here. Okay, so just two quick slides that I didn't get to on the for sale by owner. One, before we go on to seller financing. So the one thing that you'll see is if somebody is trying to do for sale by owner, where they're trying to not just sell the real estate, but they're trying to sell everything, lock, stock, and barrel, equipment, livestock, and so forth, is we've seen so many times where people just put one price. I want $1 million for everything, and they have no breakdown and no, you have no idea how much of this is going to real estate, how much is going to livestock, how much is going for equipment. And when you see that, you have to make sure that you ask for a breakdown. And it should be ideally it should be an itemized breakdown. So how much, a listing of all the cattle and the pricing you're putting on different age cattle, all the different pieces of equipment, all the pricing that they're putting on that equipment, and what's the real estate. And we've seen, unfortunately, some people push back on doing it that way. But we'll let them know that that your lender is going to require this breakdown, that you're going to have a different your chattel loan, which chattel again is the livestock and equipment, is only going to be 7-year term. Your mortgage is going to be more than that. It's not all going to be in one loan for you, so you need that breakdown for the lender. And the breakdown is also important to them for capital gains tax filing. So that can be helpful to just remind them of that they're not going to just be able to put one lump sum on their tax forms either. And I'll just mention real quickly that it's pretty rare that there's intangible business value like goodwill or ongoing concern with most farms. There can be with some that have a value-added product. But for the most part, we don't see that. It's really about the physical assets. But a lot of times farmers will put that in there. We've seen people put in values for CSA lists of customers, but has no collateral value. No lender is going to give you any money for it. So we could have a whole other topic on these intangibles that sometimes people will throw in there. This can come up with with a real estate agent too, but the real estate agent often will have people break these things down ahead of time. So for sale by owner, so from the contract to closing, it's really up to the seller to handle all legal aspects of their end of the deal. And ideally, they're going to have a real estate agent or a title company, or maybe they'll bring in that fee-only real estate agent to help them. But because they didn't go with a real estate agent to begin with, some will resist this. Now, we heard in Harold's example, they both had attorneys, right? So that's good. That's what you want to see. But sometimes we've seen people resist that. And in those cases, you may find that more work's going to fall on your real estate attorney than it should fall on them. You may try to negotiate with the seller that's like, hey, my real estate agent is doing more than they need to do. Part of the closing, can you pay some of my lawyer's fees? The lawyer's still got to work for you. The lawyer's, you're their client, but you're just trying to get reimbursed for the fees. The deposit should not go to the seller directly. It should go to an escrow agent as it would if you had a real estate agent involved. The closing documents, including the deed, should be prepared by the seller's attorney or title company, but they may not. And again, that may fall on your attorney. So I had this for questions for that whole for sale by owner. I don't know if anything has come in on that.
No, they haven't. So you can go right on to seller financing, Mike.
Okay. So the first thing that I like to get people to think about, like seller finance sounds like this is great. I can't get any lender to go along and give me the loan. And so now the seller's willing to consider this. So isn't that great? Well, I want people to think about, is it really any different from anybody's standpoint? There's still risk involved, and you still have to show that you're worth the risk to the seller. So ideally, the seller is going to actually ask you for a lot of the same due diligence that a lender would ask you for. Some cash flow projections, a balance sheet, something that is going to show that you actually have the capacity to do this. Now, they may be willing to work with you in ways that a conventional lender won't, and they'll be more flexible in making their determination, but they still, we're likely going to, if they're being, business-like about this, they're going to still want this information from you. And you want to know yourself that you're going to be able to make these payments, not just, oh, it's exciting, I've got this financing opportunity, and not redoing your cash flow to make projections to make sure that you can actually afford this. And you don't want to get yourself into a position in default, including with family, if this is a family sale. You need to make sure that there's a properly written loan agreement. So again, your attorney becomes essential in these transactions. And you need to make sure that there's proper documentation for the collateralization of the loan. So this may be potential legal costs that you will bear, but it might also be that you're sharing with the seller doing the seller financing, or maybe they'll actually produce a lot of those documents to begin with through their attorney, and then your attorney will just be reviewing them and making sure that they're in your interest. I think even in seller financing, you should do an appraisal. You just heard Harold, that's exactly what they did to confirm that really this is going to be a fair deal for everybody, and that that you're getting the you're getting a property for not that you're not financing yourself in a position that you wouldn't have done otherwise if you went through a conventional lender. Doing seller financing can and spreading out that income to them is often a benefit to the seller from a capital gains tax standpoint. So that sometimes can be a part of that discussion, that it's in terms of encouraging them to go forward with the seller financing. So what are the terms that you have to think about in a seller financing situation? So first of all, is this going to be full or partial financing? We've seen cases plenty of times where there are full financing for full term, but that's not as common, I think, as partial financing may be offered. And one thing to understand is that when you do partial financing, the other lenders you're going to, FSA, Farm Credit, they're generally going to be in first position, which means if you default and they have to go to auction, when they get the proceeds back, they get their money to pay back their loans first, and then whoever is the seller doing seller financing gets their money second or third, depending on how many other lenders are involved. And so there has to be enough equity there. And that's part of the reason they get an appraisal to begin with, to make sure there is enough equity there. If in the worst case scenario, this is what happens, or if you just have to, it doesn't even have to go to auction or default, but you sell the property, the first people you have to pay are the people in first position, and then second and third. And the other lenders are going to want to know the terms of your deal with the seller, because they're going to consider that when they make their loan decisions, because they know that you're going to have that other payment. So they're not going to ignore that. They're going to know you have to be able to show that you can cash flow all of the loans that you have. So when it comes to the down payment, this is a common scenario where it may be the source of the down payment. If your conventional lender needs 20% down and you don't have it, then the seller says, well, I'm willing to come in and finance the 20% as for the down payment. And if they're doing full financing, then they may say that they don't require any down payment, or they might say that they only need 10% or 5%. And that could be one of the advantages of seller financing. The loan term length, whether it's 20 years or 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, that's all going to be part of the negotiation. You're going to have to factor that into your cash flow. A lot of times seller financing, though, a lot of times they want it on the shorter side, because particularly if it's an older farmer, they're like, well, I don't know how much longer I'm going to be around. Now, you can set up these loans to get transferred to their heirs, but they still may not want to do that. And so they may want the seller financing to be for a shorter term. The interest rates, there's a minimum interest rate that in all of seller financing that you're required to charge to be not get in trouble with the IRS, because the seller is going to get taxed on their interest income. And you can look up online the IRS applicable federal rate, or AFR, at the time of closing, and that's what your advisors would generally do in the final to structure that. But that is the minimum interest that anybody has to charge, and that changes monthly. And the interest rate could be higher than that. That's just the minimum. So if somebody wants to charge you for instance, the Farm Service Agency interest rate, which is higher net right now than the applicable federal rate, they could charge that. Or they could say, I'm looking at what Farm Credit's charging. Now, obviously, that's not necessarily to your advantage, but that's a decision that they have to make, and that's a negotiation that you can have. And so optimally, you can have it at that AFR rate, but you generally can't get anything lower unless somebody is trying to, get around the taxes. Sometimes you can negotiate a discounted sale price of the property based on the idea that they're going to make some of what they're discounting to you back over the course of the loan based on the interest that you're paying them. Now, of course, they also have to consider inflation and what they could have, and their retirement, and what they could do with that money if they had it immediately. But we've worked out some deals where the seller will lower the price some, because they know that they're going to earn it back in interest over time. And then there's, of course, the question, are they going to finance livestock and equipment as well, if that's a part of the deal, or are you going to have to go to an outside lender? And then if you go to the outside lender, is there enough collateral there in the livestock and equipment, or what you already own and the livestock and equipment you're borrowing for? Or are you going to still have to provide the farm land as security? And then that, of course, we'll have to get into the seller financing deal. So, as I said, sometimes people will want a shorter term loan, and they may pay that off fully. Say they want a 10-year loan on the down payment, and it's amortized for 10 years, and you can make those payments, and then that's great. In other cases, particularly on where maybe you have, they might be doing full financing, but they don't want to go out, say, past 10 years. They might be willing to do what's called a short-term financing with a balloon payment. So what they're doing is they are using a longer-term amortization for the shorter loan term, with the remainder of the balance due at the end of the shorter loan term, which is called the balloon payment. So an example would be the loan term is 10 years, but the payments are based on a 30-year loan amortization and that helps keep your loan payments low. As we talked about last week, it also does mean that you're not building up equity as quickly, but it may be what you need to do to be able to make cash flow and make it work, at least in these initial years. So at year 10, then what happens is the balance of the loan is due, which is the balloon payment. And usually at that point, in order to make that balloon payment, most people aren't saving up enough money to do that, or else they would probably paid off that short-term loan earlier. Most people are refinancing that with a lender. One thing that's important to know is that FSA cannot refinance loans. So you can't go from this kind of situation and say, I want to refinance with FSA. They won't do that. We just worked through with a family in Maine that they did seller financing with someone for 3 years with the idea that they were supposedly going to refinance after 3 years. I don't know, but it was never in writing. Just goes to say all of this should be done with your lawyer. It was not in writing. The couple changed their mind, and now they're having to refinance that balloon, but they can't do it through FSA, and they're having problems because other lenders were turning them down. But normally they would have been able to go to FSA, but because FSA can't refinance, we had to come up with a more creative solution. So just here,
Mike,
quick.
just to
Yep.
time check here, you've got 1 or 2 more minutes and you've got a couple of questions.
Okay, so I just wanted to give an example of that balloon. $100,000 borrowed from the seller. It's a 10-year loan term with a 25-year amortization. The interest rate right now is based on the applicable federal rate is 4.62%. That's the minimum that has to be charged. The loan payments are going to be $563 a month. And just for comparison, if we just did a full 10-year loan, it would be almost double the payments. So that's the reason to do it this way. At the end of the 10 years, they've only paid about $28,000 down on that $100,000 loan. Didn't build up a lot of equity over that time, but that's what they need to do for cash flow. So, but now they have a $73,000 balloon. So the buyer goes and refinances. In this case, I just picked Farm Credit. And they get a loan from Farm Credit because at this point, the business has grown over 10 years. They have more capacity. They also have more equity in the land through they probably did a joint financing in this case. And so they have the capacity to retire that loan with the seller. All right, and then the last thing I wanted to just cover here real briefly was land contract or contract for deed, which is either you can look at it either as seller financing or a lease to own kind of situation, because in the main difference between this and doing a conventional mortgage is that the title transfers after the contract is complete. You're not getting the deed in your name until after the contract is complete. And that's important to know, because if you fail to complete the contract and you default, you could lose the equity that you were thinking you were building up over time, depending on how the agreement is written, and also any capital investments you've made in the property over time. So it's really important to understand these agreements and understand when and how you're gaining equity. But otherwise, part of the payments are credited towards the purchase if the contract is complete. It's commonly done as short-term financing with a balloon, but it could be for the full amount, as we heard last week in that example where the family was doing a land contract for the full 30 years. And it's most commonly be done in the Midwest. I've never seen one done here in the Northeast. I don't know if they're even done out west, but it's classically in Illinois and Michigan, Wisconsin. That's where you see land contracts done for farms most commonly. And most commonly it's been done in families, but there are examples where it's definitely, and I think we're hearing one today where it's done with a non-family. As I've already said, you need good legal advice. USDA has a FSA land contract guarantee program that was supposed to facilitate more of these to happen, but they actually haven't. Last I heard, there was less than a dozen of these done in the country in the last decade. It's not been as inviting a program as they had hoped. All right, so question.
Okay, great. Yes. So one of the questions to your last point was, does anyone know of any examples of FSA's land contract guarantee program being used? And if they do, please put it in the chat. If you know of one of those amazing 12 in that very underutilized program. And then there's a quick question about when you were describing the balloon payment. Is that the ARM mortgages that caused the financial chaos in 2008?
Well, that's ARM is an adjustable rate mortgage. So that's the change in interest rate over time. So that's not even the same topic. It's really variable rate versus fixed rate. So a lot of what happened was in that crash was a lot of people were getting much cheaper loans because they were going with variable interest rates, getting much lower interest rate loans in order to get into buy these properties. And then when the mortgages when the interest rates went up in 07 and 08, they ended when those arms ended and their rates were allowed to jump up. The initial teaser rate was a jump up. That's where that problem came in.
All right, so that's a good explanation. That's it on the question. Mike, thanks a lot. Now we're going to switch to me. And I'm going to
while you're setting up, Kathy, I'm going to introduce you properly, if you don't mind. Kathy is a senior advisor at Land for Good, where she was the executive director from 2004 to 2014. She's a nationally recognized leader in farm access, tenure, and succession. She's authored many guides and reports, managed projects, led workshops, and worked with farm families for over 35 years. I've learned a ton from her. Grateful for everything you've done, Kathy.
Yeah, so I just am not sharing my right screen. I got to stop. All right, let's try that again. Let's try that screen.
There you go.
Better?
Yep.
All right, so.
There you go.
Okay, go. All right, so now we're going to spend 15 minutes with another little drink from the fire hose, talking about other kinds of land purchasing methods. And what I'm going to do is touch on these 12. All of these are described in obviously much greater detail in the guide that Nathan mentioned is coming out in a month or so. So this is going to be sort of very high altitude considerations. Each of these has its own advantage and also cautions attached to them. That said, each is legally sound and has been tested in the real world. So these aren't just goofy ideas. Some have been around for a while. You can see the familiar names in the list, and some are more innovative. And in any case, as Mike and Nathan and I have stressed all along, you need to get expert advice. So today I'm going to slide through these 12. I'm going to talk about briefly what each method is and some of the considerations. And as previous, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. So why are we doing this? Well, as some of you have already mentioned in the chat, you know, some of these conventional methods alone are just not adequate to meet the desires of people who want to get onto secure land. So we need various strategies and variations on the theme to increase affordability, for one thing. We also want to make sure that we can expand access to more kinds of farmers in more situations in more places. In addition, we want to attract a broader range of landowners who can make their land available. And also this exploration of other methods reflects an evolving understanding of agricultural land tenure, which is something that we here at Land for Good have been interested in for several decades. Just the whole notion about property and asset ownership, what that means and how some people are drawn to it and some others are not necessarily. Concepts such as equity, both in terms of building equity and what is fair between parties, the nature and desire for debt, how comfortable people are with risk, what you think about land as wealth and land as power. So these are sort of concepts that we think about at a slightly higher altitude. All right, so in the previous presentation, there were a couple of comments about buying land as a group. So this is the first one that we explore in the guide. Simply means owning real estate with others. So I want to point out that Land for Good has a complete guide called Farming Together, which does talk about group land access. There are various kinds of ways to farm as a group. People can farm cooperatively in all kinds of ways now today, and in that guide, we're talking in particular about collectively owning real estate. So obviously the questions would come up. Why would you want to do this? What are the advantages for you? Who are you talking about? Who's the group? Is there a shared vision? Is it a single farm with multiple people, or is it multiple farms? What is the legal entity and what are the structures that will bind that collective purchase. If it's individuals, there are these legal terms called tenants in common or joint tenancy. It's a little confusing because it doesn't have anything to do with tenants or leasing. It means who owns the property. Or it could be in the form of an entity like a limited liability company or partnership, which would manifest its agreements in an operating agreement. These group decisions take time, effort, they need good communication. And as anyone will tell you, they need to be really carefully constructed as to how people will exit, as well as how new members might enter, new owners, I should say. So you'll see this is going to go pretty fast. That's the first one. Mike already talked to you about the land contract, also in some cases called an installment sale. So I won't go into this except to say that, again, the seller retains the title until the buyer completes the payment. Land contracts, there also are some red flags that can be predatory. As Mike said, you can lose your investment, and the contract therefore needs to be carefully written. All right, recently, in let's say the last decade, there's been a lot of interest in what people call lease to own. Lease to own is not a legal term, it is a concept. That means if you lease a particular property with an arrangement or the possibility of owning the leased property in the future. So there are essentially two methods, or three if you pull the second one apart. The purchase option, in which the agreement is that you and the owner, the tenant and the owner have an agreement that you as the tenant will buy that property in the future. And it will be at a price that you've either determined at the time or through a procedure to determine the price when you are ready to buy. A right of first refusal means that if the landowner puts the property on the market and receives an offer, you have the right to meet that offer. A right of first offer means that if and when the owner puts the property on the market, before they put it on the market, you have the right to make a first offer, and that landowner might accept it before it goes on the market and you're competing with another offer. The lease to own provision, whether it's a purchase option or the right of first refusal, may be in the body of the lease, or it could be a separate contract entirely. One of the things that comes up a lot is, let's say your landlord says, well, I'm going to charge you $500 a month, but $100 of that is going to go toward your building equity, toward the purchase price. In that case, you're really paying $400 in rent and $100 in building equity. That $100 is reported differently by you and by your landlord than if it were rent. So if you come up with this agreement, you just need to be clear about what's rent and what's not rent. One of the advantages clearly is that in the lease to own, it allows you time to build equity toward that eventual purchase. In a right of first refusal or a right of first offer, you have the opportunity but not the obligation to buy. So it's a good testing ground as well in this kind of an arrangement. All right, a ground lease. Now in commercial real estate, a ground lease is quite common, where the tenant owns the building and the landowner owns the ground underneath. Similarly, in an agricultural ground lease, the farmer rents the land and owns the infrastructure on it. That could be a barn, it could be a house and all of the farm buildings. And another way of thinking about it is shared equity. So the landowner and the building owner are sharing equity in that real estate. Obviously, the most important consideration is that it makes it more affordable because you're not buying the land, you're buying the buildings. Typically, the lease is very long-term. It could be legally up to 99 years as you build equity in the structures. Some of the challenges that have come up with agricultural ground leases is what happens when it's time to transfer. Ideally, the idea is that the tenant, the land tenant who owns the buildings, sells the buildings to the next tenant, who then takes on or develops a new lease with the landowner. But it may be harder to do that, especially if there are other improvements involved and so on. and also obtaining loans is not as straightforward as you might imagine. Ground lease. All right. The next one is not innovative. It's tried and true, a public sale of a farm or parts of the farm to the highest bidder. So in this case, the considerations include that you would be competing against better resourced farmers, and that the rules and procedures for these kinds of transactions vary by state and locale. So you really have to learn what are the rules and procedures in your own location. No contingencies built into a purchase and sale agreement. You buy it as is. And usually the payment is around a much shorter time frame in an auction sale. Sometimes this comes up because you see a property that might be being foreclosed or is on a tax sale list. This is where a lender sells a foreclosed property or a jurisdiction, such as a municipality where the real estate taxes are paid, might be selling the property because the owner has defaulted on the tax obligations. The process can be similar to an auction, and again, the laws and rules vary across states, and again, there aren't typically any contingencies and usually no appraisal or inspection. So more and more people who are looking for less traditional ways to get onto farmland are working with non-traditional sellers. In other words, not the farmer next door or somebody who has amassed a large amount of estate land. Could be a land trust or other conservation organization. It could be an educational institution, a religious community, a community nonprofit as owners. Land for Good had a couple of clients who were, one was a convent where this group of nuns lived there. They had 400 acres that they wanted to know what to do with as their population was dwindling. Could be a community farm that has acquired land and wants to turn it around, and so on. So these organizations could be mission driven. In other words, they want to make land available because they want to provide for low income folks or for certain communities, or they may be mission aligned like an agricultural land trust. Here in New England, we have several states that have a state agricultural land trust who are exclusively in the business of acquiring land that is agriculturally oriented. These organizations that hold land might have competitive selection processes. In other words, you need to apply and to be judged against certain criteria to make sure that they choose a buyer that aligns with their mission. And often there are specific other restrictions onto that land. And I'm not talking about easements, which I will mention in a moment, but there may be other conditions for that sale. Similarly, because there is a mission involved, or there may be, the landowner of these non-traditional seller communities might offer that land at a discount or with other kinds of sort of bargain arrangements. All right, number 8. Equity financing, as most of you might know, is the contribution of capital for an ownership stake. So instead of debt financing, it's equity financing. Equity partners obviously share in the risk and the appreciation of the asset because they become part owners. They may have a say in the decisions as part owners, or they may be silent, in which case you as the owner have complete control. As with so many of these arrangements, traditional and otherwise, careful governance structures are absolutely critical, including how that investor or investors can be bought out or how they can exit. You might imagine this could be done among family members, but it also could be done at arm's distance from other people in a community. There have been recently, there's more attention to this so-called farmland investors. These are simply investment companies that acquire farmland, typically to lease the land, but they also do lease to own arrangements and outright transfers through sales. You may have heard of farmland investment as a land grab, especially in the global context where large entities are buying up farmland and then renting it or hiring farm managers. There are so-called sort of white hat farmland investment firms that are values-based and mission-driven. They acquire land because they want that land to be farmed sustainably. They may want it to be targeted to BIPOC farmers or to beginning farmers. Iroquois Valley Farms is probably the best example. They're located in several parts of the country. Dirt Capital is another one. If they are mission driven, they may accept a lower rate of return on investment, I should say, and they also might be interested in sustainable practices. All right, maybe some of you have heard of, am I still doing okay? It looked like I had a loose connection. All right.
You're doing okay.
Okay, great, thanks. An easement is where either something is permitted, like access across a property, or in some cases, an easement is a restriction. So a conservation easement, also known as a conservation restriction, is when the rights to develop that property, either residentially or commercially, are removed from that property and transferred to another entity. That entity could be a land trust, or it could be a public entity, such as a Department of Agriculture. Many states in the US have state departments of agriculture that have transfer of development rights or purchase of development rights programs. Typically, these development rights are removed permanently in perpetuity, and also typically they have land use, conservation / farming requirements. When those development rights are removed, the property no longer has market value, so it makes the property more affordable to the buyer. If it's an agriculture-friendly easement, agriculturally related activities are permitted and agricultural infrastructure is typically allowed. One variation on an easement acquisition is called buy, protect, sell, where the entity, the land trust, and in a couple of cases, there are state departments of agriculture, they buy the land, they raise money to remove the development rights, and then sell that restricted land at the more affordable rate to the farmer. Buy, protect, sell. All right, 2 more to go. Life estate and life leases. So this is not super common, but it is an interesting option that we've worked with a couple of times, where the seller retains the right of occupancy and takes responsibility for living in that dwelling until they die or until they decide to move on. Life estate confers an ownership right, whereas a life lease is in fact a lease. So it's a slightly different legal distinction. Typically, the purchase price is also discounted because you're not conveying 100% of the rights. You're leaving the right to live on the property with the seller. Lenders may have a hard time financing with life estate, so that's definitely a consideration. And as you might imagine, having the seller on site may be an advantage if they're into mentoring. In one case, we know of the buyer having an arrangement where they provide caretaking for the elderly seller in that life estate arrangement, which was a great arrangement for both parties. On the other hand, you as the buyer might not want that seller on the property hovering around all the time. So advantages, disadvantages. All right, the last one is some landowners are increasingly motivated by social justice values, such as land reparations, such as making land available to new and beginning farmers and to more diverse kinds of farmers. Could be an organization, it could be an individual or family. Land for Good has a publication that came out maybe half a year ago, which is called Action Social Justice Landowners Can Take. So everything you'd want to know about the kinds of activities or methods that social justice-minded landowners can take in, first of all, keeping their property and doing various actions, or in transferring their property, such as what we're talking about today. These kinds of arrangements can offer unique, as in more affordable kinds of pricing or financing opportunities. They may discount the transaction costs. They may have particular selection criteria, which are advantageous to certain communities. All of these kinds of transactions require a lot of trust, background work, mutual appreciation, communication, timing, and transparency. So in summary, all of these methods require due diligence, as we've stressed throughout. Everything needs to be in writing. All of these good faith arrangements still need to be in writing. As we've said, you need your trusted advisors. There are successful models of all of these kinds of arrangements out there. If you have questions and can't find them, come in, check with us. We might be able to help you with that. And in all of these endeavors, creativity, patience, and perseverance pay off. So Nathan, were there any questions that popped up?
There were, but I think our audience responded quickly to them. So I think we're actually in pretty good shape. I just want to remind everyone that our previous session had a lot of information about places to find, different venues to find opportunities. So we will be sharing the link for the YouTube for that at the end of this webinar series, so you can review that and look at the slides. So Kathy, thank you so much for that. While Kathy is stopping the screen share, I want to introduce Rachael and Jesse Smedberg from Tulip Tree Gardens in Wilken County, Illinois, just south of Chicago. They're going to share a little bit of their story about buying land through one of those alternative methods, and as well as the refinancing. Rachael and Jesse, why don't you take it away?
Hi, everyone. We're Rachael and Jesse Smedberg. Thanks for the introduction, Nathan. I'm a storyteller, so he said I have to keep this to 10 minutes, and that's really hard, but we will. We'll follow the rules. So Tulip Tree Gardens, we're going to go ahead and did you share screen it? There it is. So yeah, we're Tulip Tree Gardens is revolutionizing local food systems. We're on a 120 acre family farm, and we're dedicated to regenerative agriculture practices. This is my husband, Jesse. I'm Rachael again. No previous agriculture experience, first generation farmers. We make a really great team. So I always say, if you're going to jump into this with your spouse, make sure you guys can work together. But just a quick brief, we started as a micro farm. We fell in love with soil. We fell in love with the lifestyle. He came to me on a pivotal New Year's Eve night and says, I'm done. He was on the road about 5 days a week for work. And so we just want a different way of being. So you can see my kids in the garden there. We started selling at a local farmer's market, but we did not come from any generational wealth. We're completely self-funded. And my biggest advice is keep your plans kind of quiet to family and friends, because they'll try to talk you out of it. So Jesse will kind of go into how we landed this farm.
Sure. Thanks so much. And thanks to all the other presenters too. And I think, like Kathy, I think that was absolutely brilliant. And I really wish I knew you before we bought this farm. But so our search for land was, a little unique. We had a piece of land found. We had 30 acres that we located. We negotiated with the landowner, and we had no intentions to move. We were going to keep our house on our little micro farm in Crete, and then we were going to farm remotely from about 10 miles away. But the owner of the land passed away 3 days before closing. So it ended up going into a trust, and we didn't have time to negotiate with the trust. So we were in a really, really unique position because I had already begun the sale and liquidation of my assets and my small business. So I had I'd already been exiting the industry so that I was in. So we ended up just jumping on Zillow, mad searching properties again. We'd been looking through properties for months and months, and we always passed up on this property because it was too big. It had a house and barns, and it was just too big. And at the time, it was just 63 deeded acres. So, and there was a 17 acre ComEd parcel as well. So it felt like a lot, but I just picked up the phone and called the real estate agent, and it turned out the real estate agent was lifelong friends with the owners. And we asked the question of, hey, are you interested in a unique deal, a unique opportunity? Let's see if it works. And they were in a predicament as well. The land had a pretty substantial Medicaid lien placed on the land, and the house was not deemed for occupancy. Okay, so a traditional mortgage was not going to work. They were really hoping for a cash offer, and nobody was doing cash offers at that time. And it sat on the market for over 4 years. So we came in and we laid out um, a pretty strategic plan that included a contract for deed, because our plan was to grow industrial hemp, and there's no traditional lenders that would lend on hemp programming alongside of our vegetable programming and prepared food side. So we ended up sitting at this kitchen table here. That's what the picture's for. So this is the kitchen table in our farmhouse, and we talked to the owner. We sat down, and at that kitchen table, we hammered out the details. We had a really polished business plan, and I'd say that was definitely really important. Farmers, especially farmer sellers that are farming themselves and have grown up in it, they can really smell a bad plan from a mile away. They've heard all of the stories, they've heard all of the different plans that other farmers have tried, and they may not know what's gonna work, but they sure know what doesn't. And so it was really important to develop a really good relationship based on trust and honesty that was backed up with really strong financials and spreadsheeting. That was the key, because in a contract for deed, we had some leverage in that we were going to alleviate, obviously, the Medicaid lien. That required an independent negotiation with Medicaid, so we had to get on the phone with them, and that went really smooth. Actually, there was enough money to make them whole, so they jumped at it. But the owners were having a very difficult time selling the land with that lien placed on it. So it was unique. But the one thing is there are a lot of farms out there that are in these situations that might be for sale, but they can't do a traditional sale, so they sit on the market, they get taken off of the market, and a lot of them invariably just end up signing share crop deals in order to pay the taxes. So the opportunity is definitely there. And we sat down at that kitchen table, we negotiated. The old farm attorney stood up and said, okay, now you got to shake hands. And we stood up and we shook hands, and they handed us the keys. The contract was finalized within a few days, and they said, send the down payment next week. It was a really profound experience. It was a farm transaction that I don't think there's many that happen that way anymore. But I think if we just continue to talk to each other, we can do more of that. So
Hey,
on the
Jesse-
contract for
Jesse?
deed side of things, yeah, go ahead.
Real quick, we have a number of questions about the Medicaid lien. Can you explain what a Medicaid lien is?
Yeah, so if in this situation, the owner's mother was 94 years old. She was the original owner of the farm, and she had gone into a nursing home about 4 years before we bought it. And during that time, the nursing home and Medicaid, they can't obviously they can't sell your farm out from under you. But they place a lien on it for the value of the expense that they've incurred. So there was the lien on the property that was incurring and growing every month that Helen was with us. And so it became a big drawdown on the asset. It became very difficult for the daughter of the owner to be able to move the property. But yeah, Medicaid liens are very real. They do exist. And
you can search them.
I believe, I know you can do lien searches. I'm not sure about Medicaid lien searches because of HIPAA laws. So that would have to be something that maybe somebody else has some better information about. But finding these properties it was a real advantage for us. And I would really encourage anybody that can navigate a lot of paperwork and searches and things and county records, that if you were able to find some of these properties, a lot of them aren't for sale because they think they just can't sell them. So you know, the challenge for us on the negotiation, oh, how do I go back? Okay. Yeah, the challenge for us with the negotiation was getting past the Medicaid lien, but it was a different type of situation because it wasn't a bank. So the bank is looking to get made whole, right? You know, you've got that officer sitting at the bank and they're trying to get every last nickel out of that lien as possible. But with Medicaid, there's a tremendous amount of property on the market and liens that just sit vacant and they don't get serviced for years and decades at a time, that Medicaid was really anxious to get this off of their balance sheet. So it was a really smooth and easy conversation. Actually, it was about 15 minutes. So, I mean, that's really all it took. The biggest challenge for us was navigating the contract for deed. So we've heard a little bit about seller financing. We had kind of a mishmash of numerous different types of financing, I guess you could say, but it was ultimately a contract for deed that included a 5-year note payment. So the payments were extraordinarily high on that 5-year mortgage. And for us, we knew that the only way we were going to be able to manage those payments was through value-added products and higher margin products. So we entered the farm immediately, and within 3 months we were selling branded products and salves and creams and candles and lotions and honey and all sorts of things, that every resource from the farm that we could draw from, we were using and we were putting into a product. That was definitely critical. And the other side of being able to make those heavy payments was the community outreach. We really wanted to be an open farm to the community. We did not want to do a closed gate scenario. And so we opened our farm stand. We staffed our farm stand every day. We didn't do the honor system. We wanted to talk to the people that were coming through. And that really built a groundswell of community engagement. And that community really started coming out to our events. We hosted farmers markets, etc., and we were able to capitalize on a lot of that. So once we got through the 5-year deal, or once we got into that 5-year deal, we were hampered by these tremendously large payments. And we needed to, as soon as we got into the contract for deed, we wanted to make sure that we were looking to exit that contract for deed. Now, exiting that was more difficult than we thought. I think we might have heard earlier that it's more difficult with traditional lenders to enter a contract for deed or a seller finance situation, just because there's so many unknowns. And so that was our situation as well. So we ended up refinancing with Iroquois Valley. Can't say enough good things about them. Absolutely tremendous organization, mission driven, really willing to sit down and listen to you. And they had some flexible lending options. They were operating as a real estate investment trust at the time. Now they're an LLC, but I think that has very little change with regard to the way mortgages are working. It's a committee-led organization that allowed us to, as both hemp farmers, vegetable farmers, and we raise hogs as well, that they were able to have us come in and sit down and speak with the committee and make our pitch. And we demonstrated the payments that we'd made for the 2 years previous. So it was a fairly straightforward transition into the traditional mortgage and line of credit with Iroquois Valley. That has worked really well over the last few years, and now we are transitioning again into finally Compeer, which is like farm credit for a lot of other locations, but we have Compeer up here. And what's great about them is they just got a lot more USDA support and grant support with regard to match funds and things like that. So we ended up, we're actually in the process right now, this month, of transitioning to Compeer, and it's been, relatively seamless, minus all the paperwork involved. And yeah, just some parting thoughts with things that have led to success on our side was margin distributions, making sure that high margins are absolutely a part of the financial spreadsheet. Exclusively low margin product has some dastardly effects with some things. So we definitely recommend higher margin distributions, diversities of profit centers, diversifying funding resources, and staying in the arena, whatever happens, no matter what. Stay in the arena. Don't give up. We have quit inside and at the house. We've quit in the kitchen table about 10 times so far, but every time we walk out of the house,
Like today.
we're farmers again. So, yeah, that's it. Was my timing okay?
Yeah, that's, sorry, Nathan, I was pushing him along. I have a timer running right here.
You guys are good. You guys are professional grade. No, thank you. Thank you so much. So I don't see any questions. We are actually going to officially end the webinar here. But people can stay on for another 10 minutes and ask some more questions to our panelists and to our presenters. I just want to let you know that we are going to send you an email with some follow-up links and other resources, as well as a link for a feedback survey. Feedback survey would be so helpful if you could complete it. We're also having a raffle drawing for a prize for people who do participate. And then I also want to say that you are free to leave. We're very hopeful that these webinars and the guide together will make it possible for people of all backgrounds, all asset levels to have success in getting land. So grateful you joined us. Don't forget next Thursday, same time, same channel, and we'll end it officially here and go into Q&A.
I actually had a question for our last presenters there. A couple questions was, you're now making 3 different funding transitions. In each one of them, I assume there was some level of closing costs, and I wondered, so now that's compounding, I assume. So can you just explain like what your closing costs were at each level?
Yeah, the tax title transfer, etc. We did have to incur those costs. Iroquois Valley actually helped out with a lot of those when we transitioned to Iroquois. They have flexibility and grant resources and things to offset some things that I think other lenders weren't able to do. And with Compeer, yes, we're going to take a hit. We're going to pay some closing costs and taxes and fees again that are going to be cumbersome. But in our situation, with the amount of grant work and nonprofit work that we do, we need more and more access to USDA grant match funding and things like that, where we can, seamlessly apply for a grant that has a 50% match and know that we've got the financial backing to get the project done. And that's where Compeer, I think, is providing a lot of value add to us, where they're saying, hey, essentially, if you can get the grant, we can get the match, and we'll work out a plan for the match, whether it's a construction loan that terminates and then gets reamortized after the end of construction, or just a traditional match out of a line of credit. The options are definitely more so with Compeer right now, with things like the USDA equipment loans. These are kind of unique. The storage and equipment loans that USDA offers a lot of times are cumbersome for a smaller lender to navigate, but Compeer does a good job with that. So.
And how long were you with Iroquois, and what was the reason why you didn't just go directly to Farm Credit? I'm not sure if I quite understood.
So we were with Iroquois for 3 years, and Farm Credit was they wouldn't lend against any farms that did hemp. So even today, even though hemp, makes up for a small percentage of our business. We had to remove that in a separate line item on our balance sheet to demonstrate that even without that, we can sustain. So that was definitely the difficult. I mean, it was impossible at the time to go with any traditional lender.
Jesse, there was a question about, can you explain why you went from seller financing to Iroquois Valley to Compeer? And I think you've kind of covered it. Can you say what, if you don't mind sharing, what was your monthly cost when under the land contract?
Yeah, so under the land contract, it started at like 9,000 a month and then went to, I think, 12,000 a month after a few. Yeah, it was ballooning over the course of 5 years. And by the time we made it into that first balloon period, we were, we knew that we needed to be researching a longer term mortgage. The reason to get out of it was a lot of reasons. We had our risk exposure was far too high under a contract for deed. We did not want to risk losing on equity that we had built. We did not want to risk, losing the farm. It was a situation where even though you know everything that you can know about each other, the things that can go wrong are the things that you don't know. And for us, it was critical that, hey, this is great. It's a great way to get onto farm. It's a great way to get onto land. But the day we got onto this land was the day we started seeking outside, seeking another safer path that was going to provide a lot of the mortgage guarantees that a traditional mortgage does. So,
Was there any
Thank you, Jesse.
discussion, like the 5-year term, that was very steep, right? So was there any discussion about doing something like with a longer term amortization and a balloon, where you would have not been paying based on a 5-year term, but your payments would have been less? So it wouldn't.
yeah, I believe this is going back a while, but I believe we could have gone for the 7-year, like a 7-year option. We were never given an opportunity to do a 10-year amortization. We actually leaned a little forward on that, maybe a little too much, but in doing so, we were really able to just claw the equity out of the place month after month while we were making those big payments. I mean, it was really important that we were able to just build and build and build that equity as fast as possible, no matter how gut-wrenching it was. Because by the time Iroquois Valley showed up, they said, well, geez, you got 40%, let's go. It was the conversation was made easy on the lender, and that's what we try to do, is try to make it an easy conversation with the lender. And unfortunately, we had to go through the pains of those large payments. But branded products, value-added products, grit, it made it go.
So were all those payments, especially in the first year when you didn't have, well, you may have had some stuff from where you started with before, but still to come up with $9,000 a month right off the bat would be impossible if you haven't even got your crop in the ground yet. So how did you cash flow that?
So we entered the farm. I had a small business. We did industrial engineering and project management for large infrastructure and government projects and automotive projects. And so I had built a small nest egg of receivables that we used to get into the down payment, and then to after the down payment to get us a few months, but it was like, I believe it was the third month. I remember it was July. We launched our first branded products in July of that year. We got on farm in May.
No, March.
March. And we launched branded products in July. So we ended up having to draw from other farmers. So we ended up, and this is a really important part too, I think, in that the products that you sell don't necessarily have to be completely yours from you. We built a network of farmers around local food that allowed us to immediately bring in and sell a lot of really high value produce and a lot of high value products that was just kind of consistently bringing that, 30%.
And then also, we did have some, smaller family and friend investment,
Yeah, we had
10,000, 25,000, people that truly believed in us, and we were able to pay back those loans for family and friends that had wanted to get paid back. So it was, a lot of the littles, we always like to say.
Yeah, it's a lot of the littles for sure. Yeah, yeah. And yeah, any sort of family and friend investment is, maybe not friend, but family investment is was welcome at the time. It was little, but it was definitely highly impactful. And that's why drawing on a lot of the littles, you got to take every little nook and cranny of that farm that has value proposition to it should be exploited. And so that's what we did. We put honey, we grew veg, we did everything.
Just Jesse, there's a question, kind of a question. It was a statement sort of saying farm credit seems pretty conventional to me. What's the difference in your experience between farm credit versus regular banks? Why did you pursue something through Compeer farm credit?
Well, Compeer's just got the network of USDA and FSA programming. Like, I mean, I can pick up the phone and call Sarah Horner at Compeer and have a brilliant conversation around USDA equipment storage loans and know that I'm speaking to somebody that really knows what they're talking about. I think, we do our checking account with Bank of America, but God help me if I ever had to talk to them about a USDA storage equipment loan. I mean, I think if you got a great, I think it maybe boils down to your banker, but for us, just the breadth of options that Compeer offers is really what drove us to settle on that. I mean, I'm not saying it's best interest rates or whatever, although I think they do get a better interest rate, but it was really about comfortability with USDA. So
Awesome. Maybe one last question. Any last questions?
I'll just comment that in general, Farm Credit is a more conservative lender than some, but it's a cooperative, and they have to be cautious about, they're lending out the cooperative's money. And so that does mean that they have a fiduciary responsibility to all the members of the cooperative to being solvent. And so that's part of it. But that's why you're often teaming up with Farm Service Agency, which is set up to absorb that risk. And, to some degree, some of these other sources like family and friends, to some degree, the investors, are willing to accept a different level of risk and are often in a position to do so.
Got it.
And I would say on those small loans, though, when we are talking to family and friends on small loans, non-secured promissory notes worked well for us. I would have never given first or second position to anybody other than the bank. So I mean, that was definitely critical too, is making sure you use a non-secured instrument for those smaller investments.
Got it. I think we're going to wrap it up here. Jesse and Rachel, you guys have been awesome. And you have such a big story to tell, and I gave you so little time to do it with, and you guys did an excellent job.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you, Nathan.
Sure.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone for coming. Kathy, Mike, thank you for your presentations today. Those were great. We'll see you next Thursday. Thanks so much. Have a great day.